The door burst open and Caleb fell through it. His face was blue. His hands were frozen claws. He had ridden 6 hours through a blizzard that would have killed most men in 4. Because 3 years ago he arrived too late, and he swore he never would again. But this story does not begin in a blizzard. It begins in the rain on a night when a girl with nothing left ran from the only man who knew her name. The rain hit like gravel thrown from a black sky. Clara Whitfield ran. She ran with one hand clamped around the handle of a small wooden trunk and the other holding her skirt above the mud that sucked at her boots with every step. Behind her, the yellow light of the Silver Creek Saloon bled through the storm like an open wound. Laughter spilled from inside. A man's voice called her name. She did not turn around. She was 18 years old. She owned one trunk. She had no money, no family, no friends in this territory, and the only man who knew her name in the entire state of Montana wanted to own her the way a man owns a plow horse. The alley behind the dry goods store was dark and narrow. She pressed herself against the wall between 2 stacks of crates and held her breath. Rain hammered the wood above her head and ran in sheets down the boards, soaking through her shawl and finding the skin beneath. She could hear hooves now, slow, deliberate. Deputy Buckley Slade's man riding the main street with a lantern, sweeping its light across doorways and alleys. The light passed over the crates. Clara pressed deeper into the gap. The lantern swung away. The hooves moved on. She waited until the sound dissolved into the storm before she allowed herself to breathe. 3 weeks. That was how long she had been in Copper Bend. 3 weeks since she stepped off the train platform with her trunk and her hope and a stack of 11 letters written in a neat hand that promised her a ranch, a homestead, cattle, and clean air, and an honest life. 11 letters from a man named Vernon Slade who said he admired a woman willing to cross the country for her future. 11 letters that were lies, every one of them, from the first word to the last. There was no ranch. Vernon Slade owned a saloon, the largest building in town, freshly painted, while everything else leaned and rotted. When Clara arrived and found her way to his address, he had smiled at her with too many teeth and eyes that held nothing at all and told her she would work for him. She understood what that meant before he finished the sentence. She had waited for a night when he drank too much, packed her trunk in silence, slipped out the back door at 3 in the morning while the saloon slept. And now she was here, wet, cold, alone in a town she did not know, with a signed marriage contract hanging over her head like a noose. 6 months ago, she had been in Ohio, a rented room above a tailor shop. Her parents had been dead for 2 years by then. Her father crushed beneath a wagon wheel he was repairing. Her mother, who had never been strong, fading through the winter that followed and dying in February, with Clara's hand in hers and nothing left to say. Clara sold the farm to pay the debts. All of it. The house, the barn, the fields where her father had taught her to mend fence and read weather and deliver a calf. When the debts were settled, there was nothing remaining but her sewing kit, 2 changes of clothes, a photograph of her parents, and the ability to work with her hands until they bled. She found the advertisement on a newspaper left on a church pew, a small square of ink between ads for tonics and land sales. Good man in Montana Territory, seeks wife, has ranch and land, willing to build an honest life. She wrote that night. She signed the contract 2 weeks later. She sold her last possessions and bought a train ticket west. 2,000 miles for a promise written in ink by a man she had never seen. Now she crouched behind wooden crates in the rain and tried to remember why she had ever believed that putting your name on a thing meant something good. Morning came gray and cold. Clara had found the abandoned cabin sometime after midnight, stumbling along a rutted trail that led away from town. It was not much. 4 walls of weathered boards, a roof that leaked in 2 places, a stone fireplace with no wood. But it had a door that closed and walls that blocked the wind, and for a woman who had spent the night running it, felt like something close to mercy. She had been here 3 weeks now. She mended clothes for settlers and ranch wives in exchange for flour and turnips and whatever they could spare. Some days she ate, some days she did not. She never complained. She believed that kindness and patience were the only things that kept a person standing when the ground itself seemed determined to open up and swallow them whole. This morning she woke early, washed her face with cold water from the bucket, patched the hem of her dress with stitches so fine they disappeared into the fabric, combed her hair with her fingers. She did not look wealthy or important or connected. She looked like what she was. A girl who had been knocked down and was still standing and intended to keep standing until something stronger than her came along to change her mind. She needed food. Her last handful of flour was gone. That meant going into town. That meant the risk of seeing Slade. She went anyway. The walk to Copper Bend took an hour on the dirt road that wound between dry hills and cottonwood stands stripped bare by autumn. The town sat in a shallow valley where two roads crossed and ambition had stalled. One main street of packed earth lined with buildings that leaned into each other like drunks holding each other up. The saloon at the center, large and proud, a church across the way with a crooked steeple, and on the corner Adler Dry Goods with faded letters above the door. Clara pushed through the entrance. The store smelled of coffee and kerosene and dried apples. Margaret Adler stood behind the counter, a solid woman with gray, streaked hair, pulled tight, and the kind of face that had stopped trying to be pretty 30 years ago and settled for honest instead. She watched Clara enter with eyes that missed nothing. Clara set her list on the counter. Before she could speak, the door opened behind her and cold air rushed in, carrying the voice she dreaded most. Vernon Slade filled the doorway. Behind him, Deputy Buckley stood with his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol, not gripping it, just resting there. A reminder. Slade saw Clara and his face lit up the way a man's face lights up when he finds something he misplaced. "There she is," he said loud enough for every person in the store to hear. "My runaway bride." He turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Adler, did you know this girl stole from my establishment and fled in the middle of the night?" Clara turned to face him. Her heart was hammering. She kept her back straight. "I did not steal anything. I took what belonged to me." Slade reached into his coat and produced a folded set of papers. Clara recognized her own handwriting before he opened them. The contract she had signed, her name at the bottom in the careful script she had learned in school. "You signed this," Slade said. His voice was pleasant, conversational. The voice of a man who had practiced being reasonable while meaning nothing of the kind. "You are my contracted bride. The law stands with me." He took a step closer. His eyes moved over her the way a man appraises livestock. 30 days, Miss Whitfield. Fulfill your obligation or I return with the sheriff and the judge." The door opened again. Edith Cranston entered in a swish of blue wool with a cameo at her throat and two women from the church auxiliary flanking her like attendants. She was 52 years old, thin as a fence rail, and she carried herself with the absolute certainty of a woman who had decided long ago that her opinion and the Lord's were interchangeable. Edith stopped when she saw Clara. Her eyes traveled from the worn boots to the calloused hands to the sunburned face and frayed collar. She smiled the way a cat smiles at a bird it has cornered. "So this is the mail order girl," Edith said. "Living alone outside of town, no family, no husband, no moral standing whatsoever." She turned to her companions with practiced sorrow. "Goodness, who will protect the decency of this town?" Clara met her eyes. "I live by the work of my hands, Mrs. Cranston. I sew and I cook and I keep house. That is more honest than anything said behind someone's back." Edith's smile tightened. "My husband is the judge of this county, dear. Honest is exactly what we are talking about." Slade leaned close to Clara. His breath smelled of whiskey and tobacco. 30 days, he whispered. "Come back on your own, or I come for you." Then he straightened, tipped his hat to Margaret, and walked out with Buckley behind him. Edith lingered a moment longer, her eyes delivering a message that needed no words, then swept out after them. Clara stood alone in the store. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter until they stopped. Margaret came around the counter. She leaned close. Her voice was low and fast. "Slade is telling everyone in town you belong to him. Edith is his loudest trumpet. She has been whispering to every woman in the church that you are damaged goods. You need to be careful, Clara." She squeezed Clara's hand once. "But you are not alone, even if it feels that way." She slid a bag across the counter. Flour salt, a small cone of sugar, and tucked inside a sack of dried apple slices. "For you," Margaret said. "And Clara, come back if you need anything." Clara carried the bag out of the store. The street was quiet. The sun was pale and distant. She walked with her eyes forward and her chin up and her hands trembling at her sides. At the corner of the general store, she felt eyes on her. She turned her head. A man stood in the shadow of the awning, tall, lean, a cowboy's hat pulled low over a face carved by weather and years. A thin scar ran along his jaw from ear to chin, pale against sun-darkened skin. Beside him, holding his hand, a small boy with round eyes and wind-blown hair. The man had been watching. He had seen everything. Clara looked away and kept walking. She did not know his name. She did not know that the boy beside him had whispered something that changed the shape of the rest of her life. "Papa, that lady is cold." Clara walked the road back toward the cabin. The sky was darkening ahead of schedule, clouds piling heavy over the mountains. The wind had teeth. It chewed through her shawl and found the cold sweat beneath. She had not eaten since yesterday morning, and the flour in her bag felt heavier with every step. Halfway home, her knees buckled. She sat down on the side of the road beneath a bare cottonwood and pressed her back against the trunk. The trunk dug into her spine. Her vision swam. She held the bag of supplies against her chest and closed her eyes, and for the first time since her parents died, she considered the possibility that she could not do this anymore. Just sit here, she thought, let the cold decide. Then came the sound. Not thunder, not wind, hooves, slow and steady approaching from the direction of town. She opened her eyes. Through the pale afternoon light, she saw the man from the awning, the cowboy with the scar. He rode a dusty gray horse with the boy sitting in front of him on the saddle wrapped in a blanket. Both of them looked tired. Both of them looked like they had been riding for days. He reined in 20 paces from her and did not speak right away. He looked at her, at the bag clutched against her chest, at the road ahead that offered nothing but more of the same, at the sky going dark above the mountains. Then he swung down from the saddle with a grunt and walked over. He moved like a man who did not hurry because hurrying gave the world the impression it could make you afraid. He knelt in front of her, eye level, close enough for her to see the lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples. "Storm coming," he said. His voice was deep, quiet. "There is no shelter on this road for 5 miles. "I am fine," Clara said. She was not fine. The boy leaned forward on the saddle. His eyes were round and serious. "Papa," he whispered again. "She is cold." Caleb looked at Clara, at her worn boots, at the hands gripping the bag, knuckles white, at her face pale and sharp with hunger but holding steady, a face that refused to break. "I have a cabin an hour's ride from here," he said. "Small, but it has a fire and a roof. Can you ride? I do not take charity." He almost smiled. Not quite, but the shape of it was there, a shadow of something that might have been warmth if it had not been buried under 3 years of grief. "That is not charity," he said. "That is common sense. Nobody should be outside when this storm hits." Clara looked from the man to the boy. There was no fear left in her, just the dry shell of it worn smooth by too much use. She looked at the child's face, curious and open, and she thought of how cold the night would be, and how empty the cabin was, and how tired she was of making choices between bad and worse. She nodded, a small nod, almost nothing. Caleb Drummond helped her onto the horse. His hand was firm on her elbow, careful not to jostle the boy. She settled into the saddle with the child in front of her, his small body warm against her chest. He smelled of dust and wool and something sweet like honey. "I am Caleb," the man said, taking the reins. "This is my son, Eli." Clara Whitfield." Caleb did not mount the horse. He took the reins and began to walk. He walked for an hour, through dust and sage and the long silence of the empty plain. He did not complain, did not slow, did not ask her for conversation. His boots crunched steady on the hard-packed road, and his back stayed straight even as the first drops of rain began to fall. Clara watched him from the saddle, a stranger who had appeared out of nothing with gentleness in his hands and a steady stride that asked for nothing in return. She tried to understand what kind of man walks an hour in a coming storm for someone he does not know. She could not. The cabin appeared against the shoulder of a hill where the land rose quiet and the wind lost its edge. Weathered boards, a roof patched with canvas, a stovepipe trailing smoke, one shutter hanging by a single hinge. The front steps sagged, but the chimney stood straight and the walls were solid and the door was real. "That is it," Caleb said. Clara stared. It did not look like safety. It looked like a question. Inside the cabin was dark but clean. One cot against the wall, a stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, one missing a leg and propped with a block of wood. On the shelf above the stove, a tin coffee cup, a Bible, and a photograph turned face down. Everything simple, everything touched by a kind of careful loneliness, the way a man keeps a house when he has no one to keep it for. Caleb lit the stove, fed it dry wood until the heat pushed back the shadows and made the room feel almost warm. Eli ran to the warmest corner and curled up like a pup. Caleb pulled supplies from his saddlebag. Cornmeal, dried beans, a strip of jerky, not much. He began to set them on the counter near the stove. Let me, Clara said. He paused, looked at her. Then he stepped back and let her work. She cooked the way her mother had taught her. Quiet hands, steady rhythm, every motion purposeful. Cornmeal mush with beans and shredded jerky. She split it into 3 portions. The largest for Eli, the second for Caleb, the smallest for herself. Caleb noticed. He did not say a word. But when Clara turned to check the stove, he switched his portion with hers so quietly she did not see. Eli ate like it was cake. He talked with his mouth full about the horses they had seen on the road and the thunder from the night before. His laughter filled the small cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Caleb watched his son eat. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A softening, a remembering, like a man hearing music he thought he had forgotten. The storm hit after dark. Wind screamed through the valley and shook the cabin walls and drove rain against the roof like handfuls of gravel. Clara sat across from Caleb by the stove while Eli slept on the floor wrapped in a blanket. "Where are you from?" Caleb asked. "Ohio." "That is far." "Yes." "Your parents, gone 2 winters ago?" Clara paused. "Father died in a farm accident. Mother followed that winter." Caleb lowered his gaze. The fire crackled between them. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality of something that had been broken and put back together too many times. "My wife passed 3 years back, and my daughter, Rosie, she was 3. Diphtheria took them both." He did not say it for sympathy. He said it the way you state a fact about the land flat and measured, because the alternative is to let it swallow you whole. Clara did not say she was sorry. She had heard enough. I am sorry in her life to know it meant nothing. She just looked at him and nodded a nod that said, "I understand," without needing a single word. "Eli survived," Caleb said, staring at the fire. "I sent him to a neighbor's house when Martha started to fever. He was not home when they passed." He paused. He was not home when his mother and his sister left. Clara saw his hands on his knees clenched. Not anger, guilt. The kind that eats into bone over 3 years and never stops chewing. The storm raged outside. Inside, the fire held, and 2 strangers sat in a small cabin at the edge of the world and said nothing more because some truths need only to be spoken once to be understood forever. Morning. The storm had passed. Sunlight crept through the small window and touched the floorboards with pale gold. Clara was already awake. She had cleaned the pot, folded the blanket, swept the floor with a bundle of twigs. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching the valley stretch peaceful and bright after the violence of the night. She set the last of the cornmeal on the table, enough for 1 thin bowl each. She did not mention that she had skipped her own portion. Caleb saddled the horse. Clara knew she had to leave. But where the abandoned cabin she had been sleeping in sat on land that fell inside Slade's sphere of influence. Going back to town meant facing Slade and Edith and all of it. Caleb looked at her as if he could read the calculation behind her eyes. "You have a plan. I will find sewing work in another town. Nearest town is 3 days' walk. Winter is coming." The silence between them was heavy with things neither of them wanted to say. "You can cook," he said. "You can keep a house clean. I need someone to look after Eli when I ride out to check the herd. You stay. You work. This is not charity. This is an arrangement." Clara weighed it. Every instinct told her not to trust another man. But Eli was looking at her from the corner with those round eyes, and she remembered what hunger felt like. And she knew that a Montana winter was not something you faced alone when you had nothing. "I sleep inside," she said. "Where do you sleep?" "The barn." "You do not have to do that. Would not be proper otherwise." His voice left no room for discussion. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Arrangement. That first night, as Clara smoothed the blanket over the cot, her hand brushed something beneath the frame. She knelt and reached under. Her fingers closed around fabric. She pulled it out. A dress, small, made for a girl no older than 3, folded with the kind of care that spoke of ritual, not accident. Beside it, a doll made of cloth and yarn with yellow wool for hair and 2 buttons for eyes. One of the buttons was loose, hanging by a thread. Clara held the doll in her lap. The lantern light caught the yellow yarn, and for a moment she could see it clearly. A father's hands folding this dress, placing this doll, keeping them beneath the bed where no one would see, but where he could always reach down and know they were there. She placed them back exactly as she had found them. She said nothing about it. Not that night, not ever. Days passed. Clara swept the floor, patched the torn curtain with thread from her own hem, boiled creek water for laundry, mended Eli's smallest clothes with stitches so fine they disappeared into the fabric. Her fingers bled sometimes, but she did not stop. The rhythm of work was the only thing that steadied her. Caleb kept to the barn, chopped wood, fixed fence, rode out each morning and returned at dusk. He never came in without wiping his boots, never spoke too loud, never once acted like she owed him anything. Eli took to Clara faster than she expected. He followed her to the well, helped carry water, asked her about Ohio and the farm, and whether she had ever seen snow. He held her hand when they walked to the creek. One morning he brought her a handful of wildflowers from the creek bank. They were half dead and mostly weeds, but he held them out to her with both hands and a seriousness that made her chest ache. She put them in the tin cup on the shelf beside the Bible, and they stayed there until the petals fell, and even then she did not throw them away. She noticed things about Caleb, small things, the way he saved the best cuts of jerky for Eli, but always made sure Clara ate before he did. The way he checked the doors and windows 3 times before sleeping. The way he hummed when he mended fence, a tuneless murmur that was not music but was not nothing either. And the way he paused whenever Clara laughed, even at some small thing, and held perfectly still as if the sound deserved to be heard completely before the world could move again. On the 3rd day, a rider came. Not Caleb. A lean man with sun-cracked lips and a squint that could have cut glass. He introduced himself as Clem Barfield, seasonal hand for Caleb. He looked at Clara the way a man looks at something he did not order and does not intend to pay for. "You brought home an extra mouth to feed in the middle of winter coming on," Clem said to Caleb. He did not lower his voice. Did not seem to think he needed to. "What are you thinking?" Caleb said nothing. Just looked at Clem and kept looking until the man went quiet. Clara felt the judgment settle over her like a coat she had not asked to wear. She had felt it before, in Ohio after her parents died, in every town she passed through on her way west. The look that said, "What kind of woman ends up like this?" That afternoon, while Clara hung laundry on the line behind the cabin, Clem walked past her. He stopped without looking at her directly and said in a voice that carried no malice but no warmth either, "You know how he lost his wife and the girl?" Clara kept her hands on the wet cloth. "No. Ask him about the cattle drive, the one he took when they were sick." Then Clem walked on, and Clara was left with the wind snapping the laundry and a new question settling in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She did not ask, not yet. She had learned that some truths come when they are ready, and pulling at them too early only tears the fabric. On the 4th day, she went into town for thread and salt. At Margaret's store, she learned the damage Edith Cranston had done. The church women were refusing to hire Clara for sewing work. Edith had told them Clara was living in sin with a man she barely knew, that she was a runaway bride with no morals and no standing, that any decent woman should refuse to associate with her. Margaret told Clara this while wrapping a cone of sugar she had not paid for. Then she said something that made Clara's chest tighten. "Slade came by the cabin while you were gone last trip, left a note on the table." Clara already knew. She had found it. The paper weighed down by a stone, the handwriting neat and unhurried. "Contract expires in 30 days. Come back or I come for you." She had folded it and put it in her pocket. Evidence was evidence. Back at the cabin, Caleb was waiting. He had heard about Edith from Margaret too. His jaw worked the way it did when he was holding something back. "You do not need their approval," he said. "No, but I need them to stop making it impossible for me to earn a living." He looked at her then. Really looked. And when he spoke, his voice carried through the open door and across the yard where anyone passing could have heard it. "She is here. That is my choice. Anyone who has a problem with that can come say it to my face." It was the first time he had declared himself on her behalf. Not grand, not romantic, just a fact stated in a voice that did not permit argument. That evening, Clara sat on the porch step while the last light faded and the cold crept in. She could hear Caleb in the barn, the scrape of tools, the murmur of his voice talking to the horse. She thought about Clem's words. Ask him about the cattle drive. She thought about the photograph turned face down on the shelf. She thought about the torn second page of a letter that she had found in a tin box beneath the cot. A doctor's letter that ended mid-sentence where someone had placed a ruler along the fold and pulled. Someone had taken that page. Someone who wanted what was written on it more than they wanted Caleb to have it. And that someone she was beginning to believe had a name she already knew. The storm came on the 5th night without warning. Not a blizzard, not yet, but a hard wind that screamed through the valley and shook the cabin walls and tore a section of the east fence clean away. Caleb and Clem had ridden out that morning to check the cattle at the far pasture and had not returned by dark. Clara heard the cattle lowing, Restless, then the creak of broken fence and the thud of hooves on soft ground. The cows were getting out. She looked at Eli. He was asleep on the cot, small body curled tight, face peaceful. Watch the fire, she whispered, though he could not hear her. Then she pulled on Caleb's spare coat, grabbed the hammer and the coil of wire from the lean-to beside the barn, and walked out into the dark. It took her 2 hours. Her hands bled from the wire. The wind knocked her flat twice. She worked by lantern light, driving stakes and twisting wire with fingers that had gone numb before she finished the first post. The cold was enormous. It pressed against her from every direction like something alive and hungry. Halfway through, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Eli stood in the wind in his night clothes, holding a second lantern. His face was pale and his eyes were wide, and he was shaking from the cold, but he did not flinch. "Hold the light higher," Clara said, "and do not look away." Eli did not look away. 7 years old, and he held that lantern like a surgeon's assistant, steady and unwavering, while Clara drove posts and twisted wire and bled into the dirt. By dawn, the fence held. Not perfect, but enough. When Caleb and Clem rode in, mud-splattered and grim, from a night of chasing strays, they found Clara sitting on the porch step with raw hands and a face pale with exhaustion. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. Her boots were caked with mud. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung around her face in dark tangles. Caleb looked at the fence, looked at her hands, looked at her face. He did not say thank you, did not say well done, did not say a single word of praise. He nodded, one nod, slow and deep. That nod carried more weight than any words Clara had heard in years, more than every promise Slade had written, more than every judgment Edith had spoken. It was the nod of a man who had measured her and found her equal, and who did not give that easily. Clem stood behind Caleb. He stared at the fence, then at Clara, then at the fence again. His squint had changed, not warm yet, but the skepticism had cracked clean through. "You know wire work?" he asked. "I grew up on a farm," she said. He said nothing more. But that night he ate 2 bowls of the stew she made and did not complain about a single thing. That evening, Clara found Caleb on the porch, sitting in the dark with his hat in his lap and the wind pulling at his collar. She sat beside him without asking permission. The cold pressed around them, but the cabin wall blocked the worst of it, and the silence was not empty. It was full. Full of everything they had not said and everything they were beginning to understand without needing to say it. "How did you learn to mend fence like that?" he asked. "The way people learn most things," she said. "No other choice." He turned his head just enough to look at her. The scar on his jaw caught the faint light from the window. His eyes were tired but steady. Something shifted in them. Not surprise, recognition. The look of a man seeing in someone else the thing he values most in himself. "That kind of learning is the best kind," he said. It was the first time she saw him close to a smile. Not quite there, but close enough to change the shape of the silence between them. Close enough to make her wonder what that smile might look like if he ever let it all the way through. She did not know how many more silences they would share before the silence itself became a language. She did not know that the next sound to break it would be hooves on the road and a voice that would turn everything she had built in these few days to ash. But that was coming. It was already on the road, moving toward her, carrying papers and power and a name she had tried to forget. And behind it, hidden beneath saddle leather and trail dust, and the quiet grief of a man who had not told her the truth about who he was, lay a secret that would change everything. Clara did not know it yet, but the cowboy sitting beside her in the dark, the man who slept in the barn and walked an hour in a storm and nodded once when she mended, his fence was not a man with a few cattle and a small piece of land. He was Caleb Drummond, and the ranch that bore his name stretched farther than the eye could see. The first real snow came in early December, and with it, the silence that winter brings to the high country. Not the silence of empty rooms or abandoned roads, but the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting to see who would survive and who would not. Clara learned the sound of it, the way the wind changed pitch when it shifted north, the creak of timber contracting in the cold, the low moan the chimney made at midnight when the draft needed adjusting before the smoke backed up and filled the room. She learned which log to feed the stove at what hour and how to bank the coals so the fire held through the long, dark without choking itself dead. Eli made a game of finding the warmest spot in the cabin, usually the corner where sunlight hit the floor for 1 hour at midday, a golden square that moved like a slow clock across the boards. He would sit in it and let it travel over his face, and for those few minutes the cold seemed like something that happened to other people. The boy was changing, Not in ways a stranger would notice, but Clara noticed. He talked more at meals. He laughed when the mush that lived under the porch stole a piece of jerky from the table. He reached for Clara's hand when they walked to the creek for water, and she gave it, without thinking, the way you breathe or blink, the way your body does, the thing it was made to do before your mind catches up. One evening she was stirring a pot of bean soup and humming a song her mother used to sing, a song about rivers and morning light and a woman waiting at a window. She did not think about it. The melody came the way memories come, unbidden and warm. She turned and found Eli standing in the doorway. His face was still. His eyes were full. He stood there for 3 heartbeats, and then he turned and walked out into the cold without his coat and sat on the porch step and stared at nothing. Clara set the spoon down. She took his coat from the hook by the door and went outside and draped it over his shoulders. She did not ask what was wrong. She sat beside him and waited. "My mama used to sing in that song," Eli said. His voice was barely there, a whisper carried on the cold air like a leaf on water. Clara put her arm around him. He leaned into her side and pressed his face against her sleeve, and did not cry, because 7-year-old boys who have lost their mothers learn early that crying does not bring anyone back. They sat there until the soup was nearly cold, and the stars came out sharp and hard above the mountains. Inside the barn, Caleb had heard the song. He had set down the bridle he was mending and sat motionless on the stool with his hands in his lap and his eyes closed. And though Clara could not see him, something had shifted in the dark of that barn. Something old and heavy had moved aside just enough to let a sliver of light through. The morning after, Clara woke to the sound of distress from the barn, a guttural sound, low and urgent, the kind that meant something was either being born or dying. Caleb and Clem had ridden out before dawn to check the herd at the upper pasture, where a section of fence had come down in the wind. They would be gone all day, perhaps into the night. Clara grabbed the lantern and ran. In the far stall of the barn, one of Caleb's best heifers lay on her side belly, distended legs churning the straw. The calf was coming wrong. Clara could see it in the way the heifer strained and thrashed and rolled her eyes white. Breech. The calf was turned sideways, and if it did not come out soon, both the cow and the calf would die. Clara had not done this since she was 14 years old on her father's farm in Ohio, the year before he died. She remembered the feel of it, the terrible intimacy of reaching inside a laboring animal, the heat and the wet and the absolute necessity of staying calm when every instinct screamed a panic. She rolled up her sleeves. She talked to the heifer the way her father had taught her, low and steady, a stream of words that meant nothing and everything. She worked her hand inside and felt for the calf's legs, found one, then the other. Twisted. She pulled gently, then firmly, working with the contractions and not against them. Her shoulders burned, her hands cramped. The lantern threw wild shadows against the barn walls. Eli appeared in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been watching. "Lantern up," Clara said. "Steady now. Do not look away." Eli did not look away. He held that lantern with both hands steady and unwavering while Clara pulled a living thing into the world. The calf came, wet and steaming in the cold air. It lay on the straw and blinked and shook its enormous head, and the heifer turned to lick it with a tongue as rough as sandpaper. Clara sat back against the stall wall, arms shaking, hands covered in blood and birth, and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for months. She was still there at dawn when Caleb and Clem rode in. They found her in the barn, the calf nursing the heifer, calmed, the lantern nearly out. Clara's hair had come loose and hung around her face. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were raw. Caleb looked at the calf, looked at the heifer, looked at Clara, and in his eyes she saw something new. Not gratitude, not surprise, something deeper. The look of a man watching someone do a thing he thought was lost to the world. Clem stood behind him, the skeptic, the doubter, the man who had asked, "What are you thinking?" He stared at Clara, then at the calf, then back at Clara. "You know how to turn a calf?" he asked. His voice had none of its usual edge. "I grew up on a farm." Clem nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man revising a long-held opinion and not enjoying the process but doing it anyway because the evidence left him no choice. He never questioned her presence again. That evening, Clara knelt at the creek to wash the last of the blood from her hands. The water was so cold it burned. She scrubbed until her skin was raw and clean. Caleb came and stood beside her. He was quiet for a long time. The creek moved between ice and stones, murmuring. "Martha did not know how to turn a calf," he said. His voice was soft, not comparing, not measuring one woman against the ghost of another. Just stating a fact that surprised him. And the way he said it without the careful flatness of a rehearsed line told Clara something had shifted. A door that had been closed for 3 years had opened a crack. Not all the way, but enough for light to come through. They walked back to the cabin together, not touching, not speaking. But the distance between them was smaller than it had been that morning, and neither of them moved to widen it. The day that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning. Clear sky, sharp air. The kind of day that tricks you into thinking the world is on your side. Clara was hanging laundry behind the cabin. Eli was stacking kindling near the wood pile, arranging the sticks by size the way Caleb had taught him. Caleb was in the barn mending tack. 2 riders came up the trail. The first was Vernon Slade on his chestnut horse, well-fed in a land of lean people, his vest buttoned tight over a broad belly, his smile wide and showing too many teeth, his eyes showing nothing at all. The second was Deputy Buckley with his star and his hand on the butt of his pistol. Slade reined in and looked at Clara the way a man looks at something he has purchased and found temporarily misplaced. "There she is," he said, "my bride." He swung down from the saddle, adjusted his vest, walked toward her with his hand extended as if they were meeting at a church social. He pulled the contract from his coat. The same papers, the same signature. Clara's name at the bottom, clear as a wound. "You agreed to this arrangement, Miss Whitfield. I have been patient. The 30 days are almost up. I am ready to take you home." Clara did not step back. She stepped forward, past Caleb, who had come out of the barn and stood between them with his hands loose at his sides. She stepped past him because this was her fight, and she would not let anyone stand in her place. "I signed that contract because you promised a ranch and an honest life. You have no ranch. What you call honest is not what I call honest. I am not going to your saloon." Slade studied her. The smile flickered. For one moment, something real showed beneath it, cold and patient and deeply unpleasant. Then the mask slid back. Caleb spoke. His voice was level. "She is not going anywhere." Slade turned his attention to Caleb, and the pleasantness stayed on his face, but something cold moved behind it. "You must be Drummond. I have heard of you. Man who lives alone on the mountain, lost his family." He let the words hang in the cold air like smoke. "She is on my land," Caleb said. "That makes it my concern." "The law's on my side," Slade said. "She signed a contract. I have the papers. I will return with a court order if I need to, but I would rather we handle this like civilized people." He gathered his reins and turned his horse. But before he rode out of earshot, he turned in the saddle. His voice carried clear in the cold morning air. "Ask him about Martha. Ask him how diphtheria really works when a man leaves his sick wife and baby girl alone for 3 days to sell cattle. Maybe he did not tell you that part." Then he was gone, dust settling behind him, the sound of hooves fading down the trail. Clara turned to Caleb. His face had gone white, not with anger, with something deeper, something old and sharp that lived in the place behind his ribs, where he kept the things he could not say. She did not wait. She asked, "Is it true what he said? You went to sell cattle while they were sick?" Caleb did not look away. He did not make excuses. He stood with his hands at his sides, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked like a man standing before a jury. "They were sick," he said, "Martha and Rosie. Fever came on fast. Doc Harmon said he needed a specific medicine. Expensive. Only place that had it was a town 3 days' ride south. Martha told me to go. She told me to ride fast and come back faster." He stopped, swallowed. "I sold 4 head of cattle in that town, bought the medicine, rode back as hard as the horse could carry me. When I came through the door, the house was quiet. I knew before I touched her. I knew by the smell and the stillness and the way the fire had gone to ash." He looked at his hands. "I had the medicine in my saddlebag. I brought it back, but I did not bring it back in time." The wind moved through the yard. Eli stood in the doorway watching. He had heard everything or enough. Clara crossed the space between them. She took Caleb's hand. Rough on rough, callous on callous. The hands of 2 people who had spent their lives gripping things that were trying to slip away. "You went because of them," she said. "You rode 3 days for medicine for your wife and daughter. That is not leaving. That is love." He did not speak, but his hand tightened around hers, and they stood that way for a long time while the dust from Slade's horse settled on the road. The next time Clara went into town, she learned 2 things that shifted the ground beneath her feet. The first came from Margaret Adler, spoken between stacks of canned goods in the back of the store where no one could overhear. "You know who Caleb Drummond is," Margaret said. Not a question. A statement followed by a pause that waited to be filled. Clara frowned. He has a cabin and some cattle on the North Ridge. Margaret set down the flour she was weighing. Caleb Drummond owns one of the 3 largest ranches in Montana Territory. Drummond Ranch. Hundreds of acres. Dozens of head. He could hire 10 men year-round if he wanted. She looked at Clara. He told you he had a few cattle. Clara felt something cold move through her chest. He did not lie. He just did not tell the whole truth. Margaret nodded. Since Martha died, he abandoned the main ranch house. Keeps a small herd at the cabin. Runs the bare minimum. Like he is punishing himself for still being alive. Clara thought of the one-room cabin, the chair with the broken leg, the coat patched at the cuff, a man who owned hundreds of acres and lived like he deserved nothing. Not because he was humble, but because he believed he had failed the only people who mattered and did not deserve to prosper after they were gone. She was angry, not at the deception exactly. She understood why he hid it. Money was not what he wanted anyone to see. He wanted people to see him. Just the man, not the ranch. But the anger was there all the same, mixed with something else. A recognition that this man was more damaged than she had understood, and that the damage ran deeper than grief. The second thing Margaret told her froze Clara's blood entirely. There is a lawyer in town, Margaret said. Her voice dropped. From Kansas. Name of Harlan Pierce. He arrived a week ago, and he has been asking about you, about your father, and about a piece of land in Ohio. Clara set down the sugar she was holding. Margaret continued. And he has been meeting with Slade, in the saloon, 3 times this week. They are working together, Clara. I do not know the details, but I know what it looks like when 2 foxes circle the same henhouse. That afternoon, as if summoned by Margaret's warning, Harlan Pierce came to the cabin. He arrived in a hired buggy with Deputy Buckley riding alongside. Pierce was tall and thin and dressed in a dark suit with a watch chain across his vest, the kind of clothes that cost more than most men in Montana earned in a month. His face was narrow and clean-shaved and careful, the face of a man who measured everything before he touched it. He stepped down from the buggy and looked at the cabin the way a man looks at something he intends to condemn. Miss Whitfield, he said. His voice was polite, practiced. The courtesy of a man who had learned that manners were a weapon more effective than any raised fist. I am Harlan Pierce, attorney at law. I represent the interests of the estate of Edward Whitfield, your father. I know who my father was, Clara said. She stood in the doorway and did not move. Pierce reached into his coat and produced a document. Your father owned 40 acres of land north of your family's farm in Ohio. The house and the southern fields were sold to settle debts after his death, but the northern parcel was never included in that sale. It remains your legal inheritance. Clara stared at him. She had not known. When the debts were settled and the farm was sold, she had assumed everything was gone. No one had told her about 40 acres. No one had told her anything. Pierce continued, his voice measured and precise. Recently, a mining company discovered ore deposits on that land. The parcel has significant value. However, as you are 18 years of age and not yet 21, and as you have no legal guardian, I have filed a petition with the county court for guardianship to manage the estate on your behalf. The words landed like stones. Clara felt Caleb step out of the barn behind her. He walked toward Pierce with his steady gait, stopped beside Clara, did not step in front of her. Pierce looked past her at the cabin interior. The court will want to know why an 18-year-old girl is living in a one-room cabin with a man who is not her husband, a man who has his own history of, shall we say, inattention to the welfare of those in his care. Clara felt the words like a blade slip between ribs. She held still. I will see you at the hearing, Mr. Pierce, she said. Her voice did not waver. Pierce studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once, climbed back into the buggy, and rode away. Deputy Buckley followed. The sound of wheels on frozen ground faded down the trail. Clara stood on the porch until the buggy disappeared. Then she felt a small hand close around her fingers. She looked down. Eli was standing beside her, eyes wide, face pale. Clara, he whispered, is that man going to take you away? Clara knelt. She took his face in both hands, callous palms against soft cheeks. Nobody's taking Clara anywhere, I promise. But her hands trembled, because she knew that promises and power were not the same thing. That evening, Margaret arrived on her mule. Red-faced from the cold and tight with urgency, she did not dismount. Clara, she said, Slade has filed a public claim in the county record that you are his contracted bride. Pierce has filed a petition for guardianship, both cases set for the same hearing, 10 days from now. She handed Clara a folded newspaper. Clara's name in print, described as a minor female requiring proper guardianship. Caleb named as an unfit associate. The language was legal and precise and designed to make her sound like something less than human. Clara folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket alongside Slade's threatening note. Two enemies. One hearing. The judge's wife already poisoning the well. That night, Caleb told Clara the rest. They sat on the porch step in the cold. Eli was asleep inside. The stars were hard and distant. That winter, Caleb said, when Martha and Rosie were sick, I told you I went to buy medicine. That is true, but there is something I did not tell you. Doc Harmon wrote me a letter afterward. He said the disease had progressed too far, that no medicine would have saved them. He told me not to blame myself. He paused. His breath made clouds in the cold air. But there was more in that letter, a second page. I never read it. When I came back from burying them, the box had been opened. The second page was torn out. Someone had been in the cabin while I was gone. Clara felt the pieces shifting. You think Slade took it? Slade collects things he can use against people. Letters, debts, secrets. That is how he controls this town. He has something on the deputy. He had something on half the merchants in Copper Bend. And whatever was on that second page, he wanted it more than he wanted me to have it. Clara sat with the weight of that. Then she spoke. If we were married before the hearing, a married woman has legal standing that an unmarried girl living on someone else's land does not. Caleb looked at her. Slade cannot claim a woman who already has a husband, and the court would see you in a stable household. Is that the reason? Caleb stood. He met her eyes. His hands were at his sides, and his face was open in a way she had not seen before. No, he said, that is not the reason. But it is the truth the law would see. I do not want to marry out of fear, Clara said. Then do not. Marry because you want to. The snow was falling, soft, straight down, no wind. I am not ready to answer that question yet, she said. If it happens for the right reason. Not because two men are trying to own me. Caleb nodded, respect in every line of his face, and the distance between them narrowed by another inch that neither of them measured but both of them felt. Then the blizzard came and everything else stopped mattering. It arrived in the second week of December on a night so dark and so cold that the trees cracked like gunshots in the forest. Snow fell sideways, driven by a wind that screamed through the valley and found every crack in the cabin walls. The temperature dropped so fast the water in the bucket by the stove froze solid in an hour. Clara woke to a sound that stopped her heart. Eli, coughing. Not the soft cough of a cold or the dry cough of dust. A deep, wet, rattling cough that came from somewhere inside his chest where no cough should live. She pulled him from the cot and held him to the lantern. His skin was gray. His forehead burned. His breathing came in shallow wheezes, each one ending with a sound like tearing paper. Pneumonia, she knew it the way a mother knows. Not from books or medicine, but from the place inside her that was connected to this child by something older than language. She needed a doctor. The nearest one was in Copper Bend, 3 hours by horse in good weather. In this storm, it could be 6, or forever. Caleb came through the door from the barn, snow crusted on his shoulders, drawn by some instinct she did not understand. He took one look at Eli, and the color left his face like water draining from a basin. His eyes fixed on the boy's gray skin, and Clara saw something move through him that was not just fear, but memory. He was seeing Rosie. He was seeing the small face that had grown still 3 years ago, while he was 3 days away with medicine in his saddlebag. Not again. The words were so quiet she almost missed them. Not again. He pulled on his coat, pulled his hat down hard. Clara caught his arm. Her fingers closed on the rough wool. You will die out there. He looked at Eli. Then he looked at her. His eyes were clear, absolutely clear, like a man who has seen the bottom of his own darkness and decided he will not go back. I was late once, he said. I will not be late again. Then he was gone. The door slammed behind him. The wind swallowed the sound of his boots and the whicker of his horse. And then there was nothing but the storm and the child and the terrible sound of Eli struggling to breathe. Clara held him. She boiled water and tore strips of cloth and laid them hot across his small chest. She held him upright so gravity could help his lungs. She sang to him. Songs she did not know she remembered. Songs her mother had sung in a kitchen in Ohio a lifetime ago. Songs about rivers and morning light and women waiting at windows, and she sang them into Eli's ear while the storm raged and the stove crackled, and the boy's breathing grew thinner and thinner until each inhale was a fight and each exhale was a prayer. She matched her breathing to his. Inhale when he inhaled, exhale when he exhaled, as if she could teach his lungs to work by example, as if the steady rhythm of her own chest could anchor him to the world when everything else was trying to pull him under. The hours crawled. Midnight, 2 in the morning, 4. The wind did not let up, the temperature did not rise. Clara held Eli against her body and gave him everything she had, every ounce of warmth, every breath, every song, every silent, desperate bargain with God or fate, or whatever name you give to the thing that decides who lives and who does not. Dawn came gray and bitter, and with it the sound she had been praying for. Hooves, faint at first, then louder, the creak of leather, a voice. The door burst open and Caleb fell through it. He did not walk through. He fell. His face was blue-white, his lips cracked and bleeding. His hands were claws frozen around reins he could no longer feel. Ice hung from his eyebrows and his beard stubble. He had been in the saddle for 6 hours in a blizzard that would have killed most men in 4. Behind him, leaning on his arm, came Doc Harmon, 62 years old, thin as a broomstick, shaking so hard his medical bag rattled like a box of nails. But alive. And here. Doc went to work immediately, hands trembling, eyes sharp. He listened to the boy's chest, mixed a tincture from bottles in his bag, spooned medicine into the small mouth with a steadiness that defied the shaking of his fingers. He packed hot cloths around the chest and elevated the head and told Clara to keep the stove burning as hot as she could stand. An hour passed, then 2. Eli's breathing changed. The rattle softened. His color shifted from gray to white to the faintest pink, like dawn touching snow. His eyes opened and found Clara's face, and he let out a cry that was not pain, but hunger. Hunger meant alive, and alive was all she had ever asked for. Clara turned to Caleb. He was sitting against the wall where he had collapsed, his coat still on, ice melting down his face, his hands useless in his lap. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him and took those frozen hands in hers and held them against her chest, trying to give back some of the warmth he had spent. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, and she cried. Not delicately, not quietly. She cried the way a woman cries when the thing she feared most in the world has come to the door and been turned away by a man who rode 6 hours through a killing storm because he once arrived too late and swore he never would again. Caleb was still for a long moment. Then his arms came up around her slow and stiff, and he held her. His body was shaking. She did not know if it was the cold or something else. She did not ask. They stayed that way until the shaking stopped. Doc Harmon waited until they separated. Then he pulled Clara aside near the stove. His voice was low. "The boy will live," he said. "Keep him warm. Keep him fed. The worst is past." Clara nodded, unable to speak. Doc hesitated. Then he leaned closer. "There is something else you need to know. Slade is pushing the judge hard. He has Buckley in his pocket, and he is filing for immediate enforcement of that marriage contract. And Pierce has been meeting with Slade 3 times in the last week. They are working together. The hearing is in 10 days. Clara looked at the old man, at his shaking hands and sharp eyes and the weight of years spent keeping silent. "Thank you," she said. Doc looked at the floor. "Do not thank me yet." The days after the blizzard were the quietest Clara had known since arriving in Montana. A hush settled over the land thick as the snow itself. Caleb recovered slowly, his hands peeling and raw from frostbite that stopped just short of permanent damage. Clara wrapped them in salve and clean cloth each morning and pretended not to notice when he winced. Eli grew stronger by the day. His cough faded from a rattle to a bark, to a dry whisper that came only at night. He took his first steps out of bed on the 3rd day, tottering across the cabin floor from Clara's outstretched hands to Caleb's, his small arms spread wide like sails catching wind. When Caleb caught him, the man let out a sound that came from somewhere deep and surprised. A laugh, short and rough and rusty from disuse. His eyes shone, and he did not bother to hide it. Clara saw. She did not speak. Some things were better left unnamed. But the peace could not last, and it did not. On the 8th day before the hearing, Caleb disappeared. Clara woke before dawn. The cabin was cold. The stove had burned low. Eli was still sleeping, curled beneath every blanket they owned. She went to the barn. Caleb was not there. His horse was gone, his saddle was gone, his coat was gone. On the table held down by the same stone Slade had used for his note was a piece of paper. Caleb's handwriting rough and slanting. "There is something I must do before I can stand beside you at that hearing. I will be back. Trust me." Clara read it twice, 3 times. She held the paper in both hands and felt the familiar tremor that came whenever someone she depended on walked through a door and did not say when they would return. Every man she had ever trusted had left. Her father left beneath a wagon wheel and never got up. Vernon Slade left her standing in a saloon doorway, staring at a life that was nothing like what he had promised. And now Caleb. She folded the note and put it in her pocket with the others. While Caleb was gone, Slade sent 2 men to the cabin. They did not threaten Clara directly. They measured the land, wrote notes, looked at the cabin and the barn and the fence line, and spoke loudly enough for her to hear. Mr. Slade says the judge will want to see that this place is not suitable for a young woman. Clara walked out onto the porch. She looked at the 2 men. They were large and rough, and they expected her to flinch. "You are standing on land that does not belong to Mr. Slade," she said. "I am asking you to leave." They laughed, but they left. That night, alone with Eli sleeping beside her, Clara reached beneath the cot and pulled out the tin box. She had looked through it before. The photograph of Martha and Rosie, the doctor's letter with its missing second page, the empty medicine bottle with the faded label. But tonight she looked deeper. She turned the photograph over. On the back in faded pencil, someone had written Martha and Rosie, June 1875. Our girls. Caleb's handwriting, the same rough slant as the note on the table. She placed the photograph down and reached to the very bottom of the box. Her fingers touched something she had missed before. A scrap of paper smaller than the others, folded into a tight square and pressed into the corner of the tin. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was different, lighter, feminine. The ink was faded nearly to nothing, and the paper was soft from being handled many times. "Caleb, do not lock yourself away. Find a reason to go on. I forgave you long before you left. Do not make me watch you die slowly from where I am. Live, Martha." Clara held the letter. Her hands shook, not with fear, with something older and deeper than fear. This was a dead woman's last gift to the man she loved. A permission, a release, a door left open from the other side. She cried, not for herself, for Caleb, for Martha, for the baby girl named Rosie who had laughed in a photograph and never got to grow up. For all the people who leave and all the people who stay, and the impossible distance between them that love tries to cross and sometimes manages to bridge. Eli woke. He found Clara sitting on the floor with a tin box in her lap and tears on her face. He did not ask what was wrong. He sat beside her and leaned his head against her shoulder and said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet but steady, the voice of a child who had carried too much and learned too early that carrying was what you did when there was no one else. "Clara, you carried us through the storm. You will keep us here." She looked at him. 7 years old, bones too sharp, eyes too old, brave in the way that only people who have been afraid for a very long time can be. "Yes," she said, "I will." She stood up, wiped her face, walked to the table, lit the lantern, took out paper and the stub of a pencil, and she began to write. She wrote down everything. The letters from Slade with their false promises of ranch and honest life, the contract she had signed, and the lies it was built upon. Margaret's account of the 3 brides before her, 2 who fled, and 1 named Sarah Willows who vanished. The threatening note Slade had left on her table. Everything she had learned about Pierce and his petition in the 40 acres she never knew existed. She organized them, numbered them, built her case the way she had built the fence in the storm, 1 post at a time, with bleeding hands and no help, and the knowledge that failure was not something she could afford. She did not have a lawyer. She had to on the arm. She did not have money. She did not have the judge's wife on her side or the deputy's badge or the weight of a man's name on a property deed. She had the truth, and she had herself. When dawn came, Clara Whitfield was still at the table. The pencil was worn to a nub. The papers were stacked in order. The case was built. She looked out the window at the pale light spreading over the snow. Somewhere out there, Caleb was doing whatever he had gone to do. Somewhere out there, Slade and Pierce were sharpening their knives. Somewhere out there, a judge was preparing to decide whether she would keep her freedom or lose it to men who wanted to own her for profit. She had walked 2,000 miles. She had mended fence in a storm and pulled a calf from a dying cow and held a child through a night that nearly took him. She had done all of it without anyone telling her she could. 3 days until the hearing. Caleb gone. Enemies closing in. No allies but a shopkeeper and a doctor who had been afraid for years, and a 7-year-old boy who believed in her more than anyone alive. She could do this too. Clara Whitfield sat back down at the table, picked up the pencil, and kept writing. Caleb came back on the third morning. Clara heard the horse before she saw it. She was standing at the stove heating water for Eli's breakfast, and the sound reached her through the cabin walls like a pulse traveling through rock. She set the pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the door and opened it. He was coming up the trail on foot, leading the horse. A second figure walked beside him, shorter, thinner, bundled against the cold. Doc Harmon. The old man carried his medical bag in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, and he moved with the stiff determination of a person who has made a decision and intends to see it through regardless of what it costs him. Caleb looked like he had not slept in 2 days. His eyes were red-rimmed and his beard had thickened into something beyond stubble. But his back was straight and his step was sure, and when he saw Clara standing in the doorway, something in his face changed. Not a smile, something before a smile. The foundation on which a smile might one day be built. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "I am sorry I left without telling you why," he said. Clara came down the steps. She stood in front of him with her arms crossed. Not in anger, in the way of a woman holding herself together until she knows whether she can let go. "You are here," she said. "That is enough." He reached into his coat and pulled out 2 documents. The first was a single sheet of paper bearing Doc Harmon's signature and an official county seal. Clara took it and read. It was a medical affidavit. Doc Harmon's formal testimony written in a physician's careful hand, certifying that Martha Drummond and her daughter Rosie Drummond had died of diphtheria on November 23, 1875. That Caleb Drummond had been absent at the time of death, having traveled to purchase medicine at his wife's explicit request. That in his professional opinion, the disease had progressed beyond the reach of any available treatment. That no action or inaction by Caleb Drummond contributed to or could have prevented the deaths. That any suggestion otherwise was without medical basis and was false. Clara looked at Doc Harmon. The old man stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin tucked against the wind. He met her eyes. "Should have written that 3 years ago," he said. "Fear makes cowards of us. Slade has had this town under his thumb so long, most of us forgot we had spines." Clara folded the affidavit and held it against her chest. The second document was a land claim. Caleb had gone to the county recorder's office and filed a formal homestead petition for the cabin and the surrounding 160 acres. It was stamped and dated and signed by the clerk. Not full ownership yet. That would take years of improvement. But it was legal. It was on record. It gave Clara an address, a home recognized by the territory of Montana. "You did this for the hearing," she said. "I did this because it should have been done a long time ago. A man ought to put his name on the place he means to stay." Clara looked at him, at his tired eyes and his cracked hands and the snow melting on his shoulders. She wanted to say something large enough to hold everything she felt, but language was too small for it. So she stepped forward and took his hands and held them between hers, and he understood. Doc Harmon cleared his throat. "The hearing is tomorrow," he said. "We should talk about what to expect." They sat inside around the table. 4 of them. Clara and Caleb and Doc and Margaret Adler, who arrived an hour later on her mule with a basket of bread and a look on her face that said she had come to fight. Doc laid out what he knew. Slade had hired a man from Helena to present his case. Not a proper lawyer, but a claims adjuster who knew contract law well enough to be dangerous. Harlan Pierce would represent himself, which meant he was confident in his position or too cheap to share the spoils. Judge Warren Cranston would preside. He was Edith's husband, which was bad. But he was also a man who had spent 30 years on the bench and took the law seriously, which might be good. The 2 cases would be heard together. Slade's claim that Clara was bound by her marriage contract and Pierce's petition for guardianship. Clara spread her papers on the table. Everything she had written during the 2 nights Caleb was gone. The original letters from Slade with their promises of ranch and honest life. The contract with her signature and his. The threatening note left on the cabin table. Margaret's testimony about the 3 previous brides. And now Doc's affidavit clearing Caleb's name. She talked through her case point by point. Doc listened. Margaret nodded. Caleb sat still, his hands on his knees, watching her with an expression that had moved past admiration into something like awe. When she finished, Doc Harmon leaned back in his chair. "There is one more thing I can offer," he said. His voice had dropped, and his eyes moved to the table as if what he was about to say required him to look at something that could not look back. 2 years ago, a young woman named Sarah Willows came to my office in the middle of the night. She was one of Slade's brides, the third one. The room went quiet. She had been beaten, Doc said. Her face was swollen and her arm was sprained, and she had marks on her neck consistent with strangulation. She told me Slade would kill her if she tried to leave. I gave her what money I had and put her on a freight wagon heading east before dawn. I never heard from her again. He let out a long breath. I will say all of this in court. Under oath. Whatever comes of it. Clara looked at him. This man who had been afraid for years and was afraid still sitting at her table offering the one thing that fear could not take away. Thank you, she said. Doc nodded once and looked out the window. The snow was falling again, gentle this time, and the light that came through the glass was the color of forgiveness. That night, after Doc and Margaret had gone and Eli was asleep, Clara sat on the porch with Caleb. The sky was clear in the west and clouded in the east, and the stars showed through the gap like lanterns in a distant window. Are you ready? He asked. No, but I am going anyway. He almost smiled. That is the only kind of ready that matters. She leaned into him. His arm came around her shoulders. They sat together in the cold and watched the dark and did not speak about what tomorrow might bring, because speaking about it would have given shape to fears they could not afford to carry into that courtroom. Morning came hard and bright, the kind of morning that does not care what you have planned, that offers sunlight and cold in equal measure, and leaves you to sort out which one matters more. Clara dressed in her best clothes, which were also her only good clothes. A dark cotton dress she had pressed with a heated iron the night before. Her hair pinned tight, her boots cleaned of mud. She did not look wealthy or powerful or connected. She looked like exactly what she was. A girl who had walked 2,000 miles and was still standing. Caleb appeared from the barn in a clean shirt with his collar scrubbed and his boots shined for the first time since Clara had known him. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair, and the effect was startling. Not handsome in the way that word is usually meant, but something better, solid, present. A man who had put on his best because the occasion demanded it and who wore it without apology. Eli wore his cleanest clothes, hair combed flat by Clara's careful hand. He climbed into the wagon and sat with his back straight and his chin up, and Clara thought that he looked like a boy who understood exactly what was at stake, even if no one had explained it to him. Clem Barfield met them at the edge of the trail. He was riding his own horse, wearing a coat that looked like it had been brushed for the first time in its life. His hat was new, his face was freshly shaved and pink from the razor. Clara looked at him. You do not have to do this. Clem shifted in his saddle. He was not a man comfortable with gestures or speeches, and what he said came out rough, like words dragged over gravel. I have watched you mend fence in a storm with your bare hands bleeding. Pull a calf in the dark by lantern light when neither me nor Caleb was there to help. Feed people when you had nothing yourself. Those children are clean and laughing and alive because of you. He paused, his jaw worked. If the court needs someone to say that, I will say it, and I will swear to it on anything you put in front of me. Clara could not speak for a moment. She nodded. That was enough. They rode to town together. All of them. A wagon, 2 horses, and 4 people who had nothing in common except the belief that the truth spoken clearly and without flinching might be enough to defeat the money and the ways in the law arrayed against them. The courthouse stood on the south side of the town square, a plain building of white painted wood with a flat roof and a flagpole out front where the territorial flag hung limp in the windless morning. It was the most official building in Copper Bend, which was not saying much, but it had a certain gravity that came from the things that happened inside it. Lives decided, fate sealed, justice attempted, if not always achieved. The courtroom was full. Word had traveled through the town the way it always does in small places, carried on the breath of gossip and the current of genuine concern. Ranchers and shopkeepers filled the benches. Edith Cranston sat in the front row, her back straight, her cameo at her throat radiating the confidence of a woman who believed the outcome was already decided. The church auxiliary women flanked her like a personal guard. Vernon Slade sat at the plaintiff's table on the right beside a thin man with spectacles and a stack of papers. The claims adjuster from Helena. Slade was dressed in his best suit, face scrubbed, pink hair oiled flat. He looked like a man playing a part in a play he had already rehearsed. Harlan Pierce sat at a separate table alone. His dark suit was cut too well for Montana territory, and his leather briefcase sat open before him with documents arranged in precise rows. He did not look at Clara when she entered. He did not look at anyone. He looked at his papers with the cold focus of a man who had reduced human beings to entries in a ledger. Clara walked to the respondent's table on the left. She carried no briefcase. She had a small stack of papers tied with kitchen string and the stub of a pencil in her pocket. Caleb sat behind her in the gallery, Doc Harmon 3 rows back clutching his medical bag. Margaret near the door with Clem beside her. Eli sat with Margaret, his hand wrapped around hers. Judge Warren Cranston entered through a side door. He was a tall man, thin in the way that age makes men thin, with white hair and a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete. He wore no robe, just a dark coat and a white shirt, and he carried a leather-bound book and a gavel. He sat behind the bench and surveyed the room with eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. He struck the gavel once. The room fell silent. We are here on 2 matters. A contract enforcement claim filed by Mr. Vernon Slade and a guardianship petition filed by Mr. Harlan Pierce. Both concern Miss Clara Whitfield. He looked at Clara. Miss Whitfield, you have no legal counsel. No, sir, I will speak for myself. A murmur moved through the room. Cranston silenced it with a look. Very well. Mr. Slade, present your claim. The claims adjuster stood. He was efficient and dry, and he laid out the case with the mechanical precision of a man assembling a clock. Clara Whitfield had entered into a marriage contract with Vernon Slade on the 15th of April, 1878. She had accepted passage to Montana Territory. She had agreed to the terms. She had failed to fulfill her obligations. Mr. Slade sought enforcement of the contract and the return of his contracted bride. The adjuster placed the contract on the judge's bench. Clara's signature at the bottom, clear as a wound. Cranston studied the document. Then he looked at Clara. Your response, Miss Whitfield. Clara stood. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the table until they stopped. Then she picked up her papers and stepped forward. Your Honor, I signed that contract. I do not deny it. I signed it in a cold room in Ohio when I was 17 years old, an orphan with no money, no family willing to help me, and no future I could see. I signed it because Mr. Slade wrote me letters. She held up the stack. 11 letters. In these letters, he described a ranch, a homestead, land and cattle, and an honest life. He wrote about clean air and open spaces. He wrote that he admired a woman who would cross the country for her future. She paused. Let the courtroom hear the silence. There is no ranch, she said. Mr. Slade owns a saloon. There are no cattle. There is no homestead. Every promise in these letters was a lie designed to bring me here under false pretenses. I signed a contract for a life that does not exist. A contract built on deception is not a contract. It is a trap. The room stirred. Slade's face reddened. The claims adjuster started to rise, but Cranston waved him down. Continue, Miss Whitfield. Clara turned toward the gallery. Mrs. Adler, would you step forward? Margaret Adler stood. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the steady gait of a woman who has carried heavy things her whole life and does not intend to put them down now. Mrs. Adler. Clara said, how many mail-order brides has Mr. Slade brought to Copper Bend? Margaret did not hesitate. 4 that I know of, including Miss Whitfield. And what happened to the first 3? The first 2 ran, left in the middle of the night. One went east, one went south. Margaret paused. Her voice dropped, but it carried. The third was a young woman named Sarah Willows. She arrived in the spring of 1876. She worked in Slade's saloon for 4 months. Then she disappeared. No one saw her leave. No one heard from her again. The courtroom erupted, voices overlapping, chairs scraping. Someone in the back said loudly what they all were thinking. Cranston hammered his gavel 3 times. Order. He looked at Slade. The pleasant mask had cracked. Underneath it, something ugly was showing through. Mr. Slade, do you wish to respond to this testimony? Slade stood. She is lying, he said. His voice was controlled, but his hands were not. They gripped the edge of the table and his knuckles were white. Sarah Willows left of her own accord. I have no idea where she went. Cranston's eyes moved to Doc Harmon. The old man was already standing as if he had been waiting for this moment, the way a man waits for a wave he knows is coming. Your Honor, Doc said, I have something to add. Approach. Doc walked forward. His medical bag was still in his hand. He set it on the floor beside the bench and straightened his back and looked the judge in the eye. In October of 1876, Sarah Willows came to my office at 2 in the morning. She had been beaten. Her face was bruised, her left arm sprained. She had marks on her neck consistent with strangulation. She told me that Vernon Slade had attacked her when she tried to leave the saloon. She told me he said that no one leaves. Doc's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. I gave her money from my own pocket. I arranged for her to leave on a freight wagon that departed before dawn. I told no one because I was afraid of Slade, afraid of what he could do to me, to my practice, to this town. He paused. The courtroom was absolutely still. I was a coward. I am telling the truth now because there is a young woman in this courtroom who deserves better than my silence. The silence that followed was not the quiet of an empty room. It was the dense, charged quiet of a place where something has shifted and everyone knows it, and no one knows yet what shape the new world will take. Slade's face had gone from red to gray. The claims adjuster was staring at his papers as though they contained instructions for a situation that had moved far beyond contract law. Deputy Buckley, sitting near the back, had removed his hand from the vicinity of his pistol and was looking at the floor with the expression of a man calculating how quickly he could reach the door. Judge Cranston studied Slade for a long time. His face gave nothing away. Then he turned to Harlan Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, your petition." Pierce rose. He was smoother than Slade, calmer. He had the trained composure of a man who argued for a living and did not rattle easily. He presented his case in crisp, measured sentences. Clara Whitfield was 18 years of age, not yet 21, and had no legal guardian. She was living in an irregular domestic arrangement with a man who was not her husband. A valuable inheritance, 40 acres of land in Ohio with recently discovered ore deposits, required proper management. As a qualified attorney, he was the natural choice for court-appointed guardianship. He placed his petition on the bench. Detailed, professional, the work of a man who understood that law was a weapon and knew how to aim it. Clara stood again. She reached into her stack of papers and pulled out 2 documents. The first was Caleb's homestead claim. She placed it on the bench. "Your Honor, this is a formal land claim for 160 acres filed with the county recorder 3 days ago. The cabin where I live is on legally claimed land. I have a roof, I have food. I have been supporting myself and helping to run this homestead through honest labor." Then she looked at Pierce. "Mr. Pierce says I am not yet 21 and need a guardian. I would like the court to consider that I have traveled 2,000 miles alone, that I have worked every day since I arrived in this territory, that I have mended fence in a blizzard, delivered a calf in the middle of the night, and nursed a sick child back to health without help from any man in this room except the one sitting behind me." She did not gesture toward Caleb. She did not need to. "Mr. Pierce did not come to Montana because he cares about me. He came because my father's land has ore on it, and whoever controls me controls the land. He is not here for Clara Whitfield. He is here for profit." Pierce's jaw tightened, but his expression held. Cranston examined the homestead document. His face gave nothing away. "Is there anyone else who wishes to speak to the character of Miss Whitfield and the circumstances of this case?" he asked. Clem Barfield stood up. He had been sitting near the back, his new hat in his lap, looking like a man trying to swallow something large and sharp. He walked to the front of the courtroom and stood before the judge with his shoulders squared and his hands at his sides. "Your Honor, I work for Caleb Drummond, have for 4 years seasonal. When he first brought Miss Whitfield to the cabin, I thought he was out of his mind. More mouths to feed in a hard winter. I said as much to his face." He paused, looked at Clara, then back at the judge. "I was wrong. I have watched that woman fix fence in a blizzard with her bare hands bleeding. I have seen her pull a breech calf in the middle of the night by lantern light when neither me nor Caleb was there to help. I have eaten her cooking when she had so little that I know she went without so the rest of us could eat. That boy is clean and laughing and alive because of her. If this court needs someone to say that Clara Whitfield can take care of herself and everyone around her, I am saying it. And I will swear to it on anything you put in front of me." He sat down. His face was red. He put his hat back on and stared straight ahead and did not look at anyone. The courtroom was quiet. Even Edith Cranston had lost the satisfied expression she had worn all morning. She was looking at her husband on the bench with an uncertainty Clara had never seen on her face before. Judge Cranston sat still for a long moment. He looked at the papers spread before him. The contract, the letters, the affidavit, the land claim, the guardianship petition. He looked at Slade, whose gray face had not recovered its color. He looked at Pierce, whose composure had not recovered its cracks. He looked at Clara, standing alone at her table with kitchen string around her documents and a pencil stub in her pocket. Then he looked at Eli. The boy sitting with Margaret, silent and still watching, with eyes that understood more than any child should have to understand. Cranston picked up the gavel. I have heard sufficient testimony to render judgment on both matters. On the matter of the marriage contract between Vernon Slade and Clara Whitfield, the court finds that the contract was entered into under materially false representations. Mr. Slade represented himself as a ranch owner offering an honest domestic arrangement. Evidence shows he is a saloon proprietor who has engaged in a pattern of deception involving multiple women brought to this territory under false pretenses. The contract is void. Miss Whitfield has no obligation to Mr. Slade, contractual or otherwise. He paused. The room held its breath. Furthermore, the testimony of Dr. Harmon regarding the assault and disappearance of Sarah Willows raises serious questions about Mr. Slade's conduct that warrant investigation by the territorial marshal. Mr. Slade is to be detained pending that investigation. Deputy Buckley is suspended from duty, effective immediately pending review of his involvement. Two men from the back of the room, ranchers deputized that morning by the judge's order, moved toward Slade. He stood. His face was a mask of nothing. For one moment, his eyes found Clara's across the courtroom. What she saw there was not anger or hatred, but something worse. The flat recognition of a man who has been outplayed by someone he considered beneath him. They let him out. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. On the matter of the guardianship petition filed by Harlan Pierce, the judge continued. The court finds insufficient grounds to place Miss Whitfield under guardianship. She has demonstrated self-sufficiency under extraordinary hardship. She has secured stable housing on legally filed land. Multiple witnesses have testified to her competence and character. Mr. Pierce's interest appears to be primarily financial in nature. The petition is denied. Cranston set down his gavel. He looked at Pierce. Mr. Pierce, if you wish to be part of Miss Whitfield's life or to assist with the management of her inheritance in a legitimate capacity, that door is open. But guardianship for the purpose of controlling a mining asset is not something this court will grant. Pierce stood. He gathered his papers with the precise movements of a man who packs a bag the same way whether he has won or lost. He closed his briefcase. He straightened his coat. He walked toward the aisle. As he passed Clara, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, not angry, not triumphant, just clear. You can write to me, she said, whenever you want, if you mean it. Pierce stopped. For 1 second, something moved behind the professional mask. Something that might have been shame or might have been the faint ghost of a conscience he had spent years learning to ignore. He did not speak. He walked out of the courtroom and into the cold Montana morning, and Clara did not know if she would ever see him again. She found that she did not need to know. The courtroom emptied slowly. People filed past Clara with nods and murmurs. Some of the women who had whispered about her in the street now looked at her with something different in their eyes. Not all of them. Edith Cranston swept past without a glance, her back rigid, her jaw set. But 3 other women stopped, touched Clara's arm, said small things that meant more than they sounded. You did well today. We are glad you stayed. My husband could use a good seamstress if you are still looking for work. Margaret reached her first, wrapped her arms around Clara without saying a word, and held on tight. Clem stood at a distance, hat in hand, looking at the floor. Clara walked over to him. Thank you, she said. He looked up. His eyes were bright. He shrugged one shoulder the way men do when they are feeling too much and have no practice expressing it. Just told the truth, he said. That is all. Doc Harmon was the last to leave. He stood by the door with his medical bag in hand, looking older than he had that morning, but somehow lighter, as if the weight he had carried for 2 years had finally been set down. Clara took his hand. You were brave, she said. He shook his head. You were brave. I was just late. He squeezed her hand. Take care of that family, Miss Whitfield. You earned it. The ride home was quiet. Eli sat in the back of the wagon chewing a crust of bread and watching the trees go by with the bottomless fascination of a child who has no idea the world almost took everything from him. Caleb drove. He had not spoken since they left the courthouse. His hands on the reins were steady. His face was calm. But there was something gathering behind his eyes, something that had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment was almost here. Halfway home, where the road passed through a stand of cottonwoods, and the snow had begun to melt into patches of brown earth and new green, he pulled the wagon to a stop. Clara looked at him. Why are we stopping? He set the brake, wrapped the reins around the post, climbed down from the seat, walked around to her side of the wagon and stood there looking up at her with the trees behind him and the sky wee and pale and the first real warmth of spring touching the air. In the courthouse, he said, I told you that marrying was a legal solution, that it would protect you. That it was true, but it was not the reason. Clara did not move. She watched him from the wagon seat and felt something shift inside her chest. A tectonic thing, slow and deep. I want to be with you, he said, not because of law, not because you need protection, not because I owe you or you owe me, because this life, this cabin, this boy of mine, the sound of your voice in the morning and the way you laugh when you think no one is listening, it is everything I told myself I would never have again. And I was wrong to tell myself that. He looked at his hands, then back at her. I do not have a ring, I do not have much of anything, but I have this land and these hands and whatever time God gives me, and I want to spend it beside you. Not behind you, not in front of you, beside you. Clara climbed down from the wagon. She stood in front of him. Eli was watching from the back, silent, his bread forgotten in his hand. I do not need you to save me, Clara said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were clear. I know, Caleb said. You saved yourself. I watched you do it. I need you to stay. I will not go anywhere. I would die before I left. She looked at him for a long time, at the scar on his jaw, and the lines around his eyes, and the hands that had carried his son through the heat, in the cold, and the dark. She saw the man who had ridden 6 hours through a blizzard for a child, the man who slept in a barn for months to protect her reputation, the man who had laid a small dress beneath his cot and kept a cloth doll with a loose button where he could reach it in the dark because that was the only way he knew to hold on to what he had lost. And she saw Martha's letter folded small and pressed into the corner of a tin box. The words she had read by lantern light, do not lock yourself away. Find a reason to go on. I forgave you long before you left. Live. Martha had given permission, and Clara had read it. And now she was standing in a muddy road between melting snow and bare cottonwoods, looking at the man that permission was meant for. Then marry me because you want to, she said. Not because of a courtroom, not because of a contract, because you want to. I want to, he said. More than I have wanted anything since the day I forgot how to want. She stepped forward. He stepped forward. And in the middle of a muddy road with the trees bare and the sky wide open, and the last of the winter melting into the earth, they kissed for the first time. It was not the kiss of young lovers or the desperate kiss of people who have run out of options. It was soft and sure and unhurried. The kiss of two people who had lost everything and found each other and understood that what they were building was not a fire, but a hearth. The kind of warmth that does not blaze and fade, but holds steady through the long nights and the hard years and the ordinary days that make up a life. In the back of the wagon, Eli smiled, a real smile, the kind he had not worn since before his mother died. Does this mean Clara is staying? He asked. Caleb looked at his son. His eyes were no longer tired, no longer haunted, no longer searching for something they had lost. It means we are building, he said. They held the wedding under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin on a morning in late March, when the first buds were breaking on the branches and the air smelled of wet earth and pine and the distant promise of summer. There was no preacher, no church, no congregation, just 5 people standing in a clearing with the mountains behind them and the sky above them and the dirt beneath their feet. Margaret Adler stood to one side as witness, her eyes red, her jaw set against the emotion that kept trying to break through. Clem Barfield stood to the other, hat in hand, looking as uncomfortable as a man can look, while also looking deeply and unmistakably moved. Caleb took Clara's hands, rough on rough, callous on callous, the hands of 2 people who had spent their lives holding on to things that tried to slip away and had finally found something worth gripping. I give you all I have, he said, these hands, this land, my name, my word. I can carry you when you are tired, and I will never leave. His voice did not shake. His eyes did not leave hers. Clara spoke. Her voice was clear as creek water. I have known loss, she said. I have known the kind of silence that fills your bones and makes you wonder if you will ever hear anything again. But with you, I hear life. I hear Eli laughing. I hear the fire in the morning and the creek at night and your boots on the porch when you come home. I am not afraid of the road ahead. I will walk it with you. And if I have to, I will carry you. Eli stepped forward. In his hands he held something small and fragile, a flower, purple, barely larger than a thumbnail, dried and pressed flat between 2 squares of paper. He had found it by the creek 2 weeks earlier, the first wildflower of spring, and he had pressed it in the pages of the Bible on the shelf above the stove. He laid it between their joined hands. Caleb looked at the flower, then at Eli. Why the Bible? So we remember the first sign of spring, the boy said. Clara's heart was so full she could not speak. Caleb knelt, and together with Clara, they placed the flower in a small hole they had dug at the base of the cottonwood tree. They covered it with dirt and pressed the earth flat with their palms. A flower buried where a family began. They stood. Caleb kissed her forehead. She kissed his scarred jaw. And Margaret cried openly, and Clem looked at the sky and blinked hard, and Eli wrapped his arms around both of them and held on as if the three of them were one thing now and could never be pulled apart. 5 years passed. The cabin grew. New walls went up, then new rooms, then a proper porch with posts that did not sag and a railing Caleb built from cedar that smelled sweet in the rain. The barn doubled in size. The fence line extended across the north ridge and down to the creek. The herd grew to 40 head, then 60. A chicken coop appeared, then a smokehouse, then a garden where Clara planted cabbage and carrots and the wildflowers that Eli brought home from the creek bed every spring. Caleb had returned to managing the full ranch. Not all at once, slowly the way a man re-enters a house he once fled, opening one room at a time, letting the light in gradually. He hired more hands, rebuilt sections of fence that had fallen during the years he spent punishing himself for being alive. The Drummond Ranch regained its name and its reputation not because Caleb sought glory, but because the land responded to care the way all living things do, with growth and abundance, and the quiet reward of something tended well. Eli was 12 now, tall and sun-browned and wiry. He followed Caleb everywhere and mimicked everything from the way he walked to the way he squinted at the horizon. He could split kindling without splintering it and carry 2 buckets of water without spilling a drop. He had developed a laugh loud and sudden that came from some deep well of joy that Clara had not known existed in him when she first saw a shivering boy wrapped in a blanket on a dusty gray horse. And there were 2 more. Hannah was 3, black-haired and loud and fearless. She had been born in the cabin with Doc Harmon attending and Eli holding the lantern, and she had entered the world screaming as if she already had opinions about it. She ran through the yard and climbed the fence rails and pulled the dog's ears and called every animal on the ranch by a name she had invented and no one else could remember. The youngest was Thomas, 1 year old, named for Clara's grandfather, the man who had first worked the land in Ohio and whose name had been spoken in her mother's kitchen with reverence and warmth. Baby Thomas had Caleb's eyes and Clara's stubborn chin, and he had recently learned to say one word with perfect clarity: Papa. He said it every time Caleb walked through the door, and every time Caleb stopped whatever he was doing and picked the boy up and held him against his chest with the same tenderness he had shown that first day on the road when he lifted a stranger's son onto his saddle and carried him through a coming storm. Clem Barfield still came each season. He brought his wife Ada, now a quiet woman with steady hands, and their son, a tow-headed boy of 4 who played with Eli and came home covered in mud and happiness. Clem no longer squinted at Clara with suspicion. He greeted her with a nod that contained the entire history of a man who had been wrong about someone and had spent years being right about them instead. Margaret Adler still tucked extra sugar into Clara's grocery bag, still squeezed her hand across the counter, still said for the children with a wink that both of them understood. Doc Harmon came quarterly to check the family. He was slower now, his hands less steady, his steps more careful. But his eyes were sharp and his spine was straight, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had found his courage late but had not let it go since. Edith Cranston had not spoken to Clara in 5 years. Clara did not mind. Some doors are better closed. Slade's saloon had been sold to a man from Billings who turned it into a general store. Slade himself had been sent to the territorial prison after the investigation uncovered not just the Sarah Willows incident, but a pattern of fraud and coercion stretching back 7 years. He would not be free for a long time. Harlan Pierce had written once, a short letter, stiff and formal. He asked about Clara's health and inquired about the status of the Ohio land. He said nothing about guardianship or courts. Clara wrote back. She told him she was well. She invited him to visit. He never responded. But she kept the door open because that was what Clara Whitfield did. She kept doors open, even the ones that might never be walked through. On a warm evening in late spring, Clara stood at the cabin door and watched her children play in the yard. Eli chasing Hannah around the woodpile, Thomas sitting in the dirt pulling at the dog's tail, the garden coming up green, the fence line running clean and straight across the ridge. She reached out and touched the cottonwood tree. It had grown taller and broader in 5 years, its roots deep, its branches spreading wide enough to shade the entire porch in summer. Somewhere beneath it, pressed into the earth, was a dried purple flower that a boy had placed between two scarred hands on a morning when the world decided to begin again. Caleb came up behind her, his arms circled her waist, his chin rested on her shoulder. He smelled of pine sap and leather and the sweet cedar of the porch railing he had just finished sanding. "You remember," she asked. He did not need to ask what. "The day you said you could carry them." He looked out at the yard, at the children tumbling and shouting and chasing the dog through the spring grass, at the garden coming up green, at the fence line stretching clean and straight, at the life they had built from nothing, from a rainy night and a muddy road and a bowl of cornmeal shared with a stranger. "There are more of them now," he said. She laughed, a full laugh, open and warm and unafraid. Not the short, startled sound she had made that first winter when something small surprised her. This was the laugh of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side with her hands full and her heart intact. "But you can still carry them." Caleb looked at her. His face had more lines now. His hair had streaks of gray at the temples. His hands were rougher than ever, scarred and calloused and strong. But his eyes were warm. The tiredness that had lived behind them for so long was gone, replaced by something that looked like peace. "Always," he said. The wind moved through the valley. It stirred the grass and rustled the cottonwood leaves and carried with it the smell of earth and wildflowers and the smoke from a chimney that stood straight and true. The sky was wide and the mountains were blue, and the road that Clara Whitfield had walked so long ago stretched empty in the distance, carrying no one leading nowhere she needed to go. She was already home. Above the clearing, the sky was clean. No clouds, no storms gathering on the horizon, and not a single buzzard in sight.